So I'm going to start with the chart of accounts. When we talk about a chart of accounts within Serenic Navigator, for us, that means the general ledger account or the OptiCode line item. So this is where we start to see how the system is really fully integrated and connected throughout. So for us, we're looking at this chart of accounts, and this is just the heart of the system. Everything flows into this screen. This then becomes the basis for all of my financial reporting. One of the things that you'll notice is when I first came in here, I'm seeing all general ledger accounts. So I've got my assets. If I scroll down, you'll see I've got my liabilities, revenues, and expenses. So it's my entire chart of accounts. This number is also unfiltered. So this is a life-to-date ending balance. So for balance sheet accounts, that might make sense. I'm looking at the balance sheet accounts as of 9/30, but if I wanted to look at it as of 8/31, I would need to provide some criteria to filter those numbers down. So one of the things that I've done in this view, again, to just show how I can personalize it to how I work in the system, is I've created what's called a saved view. So this is something I've done for myself in my role, and I've created a view now that is pre-filtered. I'm looking at just expenses, which is the 7,000 through 999 on my accounts. And I have filtered it to my current fiscal year. So now I've created a view that allows me to quickly get to what I'm looking at more often. I can create any number of views. So I could create views that are filtered by particular programs or particular grants or other date ranges. One of the beauties of this view is that I have the ability to filter on any date range, regardless of what my fiscal year is. So I could create a view for a grant that goes from 7/1 to 6/30, even though my fiscal year end is 12/31. So it's a very dynamic functionality. In this view, you're going to see I've got budgets, commitments, encumbrances, and actual expenses. So this is another area where we've really taken a very unique approach of being able to incorporate all of our spending activity and commitments into our financial reporting. So for us, what commitments mean are requisitions, purchase requisitions that have been entered into the system and have been approved. They haven't created a purchase order yet, but it's been a request that's been entered and approved. Then it becomes a commitment. Once an item is created, either entered as a purchase order or a commitment is converted to a purchase order, it moves into this encumbrance column. What's really nice about how it connects here with the chart of accounts is that this available column reflects budget minus commitments, minus encumbrances, minus actual. So now it becomes a much truer picture of what my budget available looks like. Additionally, I had mentioned that this has to do with items that are fully approved, is when they become committed or encumbered. But part of my personalization that I can do is I can show columns that show pending transactions. Maybe they have been entered and they're in the approval process, but they have not been fully committed or encumbered yet. So I can actually show those in another column and again, have it more visible to me. So I don't have to go look at my list of POs and say, okay, what's out here that hasn't been encumbered? I can see that all right here from this initial view. We talk a lot about this being a Microsoft product and being fully integrated with our other Microsoft products and specifically Microsoft Office. So you're going to see a couple of different examples of that. But first, what you see here on this particular view, and you'll see this on any of the grid views in the system, is this option to open in Excel. So when you're looking at this open in Excel, if I click on it, it actually creates an Excel file. And when I open that, you'll see that it's actually created the Excel file to exactly match my view as I have it defined. And now I've got a static snapshot of that same information. Scroll down and look here at my office supplies. So this is a good example of where I'm seeing that I've entered a budget. I've got commitments. Those are those approved requisitions that have not been purchase orders yet sent off to the vendor. I've got purchase orders that are pending in the system. And then I have actual expenses. And this is an example where now I'm over budget. So I have a reason that I want to look at this detail. Did someone miss putting in a budget? Did something get miscoded? I want to be able to see what supports those numbers. So within the same view, you'll notice that all of these amounts are hyperlinks. So if I click on that link, it then takes me to a pre-filter view of all of my general ledger activity that supports that amount. Again, I can open it in Excel, so you'll see that's incorporated on other views on the screen. I can scroll down and I see things like descriptions, vendor information, who it's linked to. I'm going to highlight one of these items here. So here's an item that came through the accounts payable module. This is all activity that is incorporated from other parts of the system. In looking at this, maybe I have a question. Is this the total invoice amount, or is this part of an invoice that maybe hit multiple account codes? I really can't tell that fully from here. With a lot of other accounting systems, when something posts from a subsidiary module, that link is lost. And so I would have to close the screen, go over to accounts payable, pull up the vendor record and look at the activity. With Serenic Navigator, we have that thread is fully maintained. I can always navigate back to my source documentation. So I'm highlighting this invoice. I want to know a little more about it. So I'm going to click on my option that says Find Entries. And what it's doing is it's searching through the entire system and looking for all of the activity that's linked to that general ledger. And you'll see that it was created by a posted purchase invoice from accounts payable. And I have a hyperlink here that I can drill into that record. It has now gone over to accounts payable, found that vendor activity, and this is a view of that original invoice entry screen. It's completely non-editable in order to preserve our audit trail, but now I can see everything as it was entered by my AP team. As I scroll down, you can see how this item was coded. I can also see an audit trail. All of the transactions within the system maintain an audit trail. I can always go back and find, excuse me, regardless of how it was posted to the general ledger, it might have been posted with a date of 5/31, but my audit trail says that the person that did the data entry actually did it on 6/22. There's additional information even behind this. I could get so far as to find out exactly the system date and time that that information was entered. I'm going to close this view and come back here to general ledger. So you'll notice I just closed my screens and I'm right back to where I started. I'm going to look at another entry here in a minute, but something else I want to highlight here. I talk about this chart of accounts as being the heart of the system. Because this is designed for nonprofit governmental type organizations, we always have to have a funding source. So you'll notice that there's a segment here called fund number. The fund number is hard and fast, along with the general ledger account code. Every transaction is going to have those two components. Additionally, as we're building the account structure and doing your implementation, there's a lot of conversation that oftentimes will happen around what that structure needs to look like. A lot of organizations have a very set structure, but what I'm showing you here in my demo set is I've created segments for department, program, and project to be used in the system. Each of these segments is defined independently and can be reported on independently. So the beauty of that is I can run a general ledger financial statement that is broken down by department, even if a department covers multiple programs. I can have a different report. I could run the same report that's broken down by program or by department and program combined. So I can report on any of these segments independently. So this is just one example of what an account structure can look like. I just want to show another example. So this is more in line with what a lot of the school districts have to work with and what that structure looks like. So we've got, again, the GL account and the fund are those hard and fast rules, have to always be there. And in this case, we've got 5 additional segments that are defined as optional to be used in the account structure. One of the things that's important to note here is each one of these segments can be alphanumeric and up to 20 characters long. So there's plenty of room for growth. So if we were looking at fund here, for example, I've defined it as a single character, but if a year down the road it's decided that that's not sufficient and our fund number really needs to be 2 digits, it's a very simple matter to change that to 2 and then just start using a 2-digit fund number. So even though this would be defined with how you might be doing it today, if things were to change in a year, we can adapt the system to accommodate that. And you're going to see this account structure throughout all of the activity that's posted in the system. Come down and pull up a different invoice. Let me do the same thing. I'm going to drill in on that posted purchase invoice. So again, it's taking me to the accounts payable activity. This one's a little bit different. The prior invoice was something that was entered directly into accounts payable. It was never linked to a purchase order. So I may have certain expenses that never have a purchase order if I'm processing things like utility payments. However, a lot of our invoices are going to be associated with purchase orders. So you'll see here that I've now got a field that says order number and it's populated where it was blank on that previous invoice. So this purchase order is what was used to eventually create this invoice. So at the time I received my goods and received my paperwork against that PO, this invoice got created and was then available to be paid. But I want to see more information about this purchase order. So within this same view, again, I can follow that thread back. So now I've gone from the general ledger to my accounts payable invoice function and screen. And now I can trace back to the original purchase order as it was entered in the system. So this is now my purchase order information. I can see who entered the purchase order. I can see the GL coding. So this is where you see that fund again. And all of those other segments that we talked about is all part of that purchase order entry. I have my audit trail, so I can see who created it and when. And you'll notice that there's a column here that says number of approvals. So if I'm doing workflow approvals in the system, I'll actually have information in here as well. So I've got a couple of examples where you have a chance to see that. And then as I close these screens, it'll just take me back to where I came from. So I'm closing the purchase order, I'm back on the invoice. I close the invoice, I'm back to that navigate screen. And now I'm back to my general ledger account detail. So it's just a really powerful tool for being able to research items, not necessarily print a bunch of reports with all kinds of activity, not needing to close one area and go into another area. I can just follow that thread all the way back through the system. I'm going to leave the chart of accounts for now. I'm going to show some other functionality. I'm going to show that from the vendor record. And I'm going to pull up one of my vendors here. So this is a vendor record. I've got a balance on this vendor. Again, you notice that these amounts are hyperlinks. So I can drill in and look at that activity that supports that amount. And again, navigate back, see how it was posted to the GL, see if it came from a purchase order, see if it came from a requisition. As you scroll down, you'll notice that there is fields related to 1099s. So you would define any vendors that are either non-employee compensation vendors or 1099 miss vendors. You would actually define that on the vendor record. And then as activity is processed for that vendor, that information is captured and then becomes part of the 1099 processing out of the system. So there's no third-party application that needs to be used to be able to process 1099s. Those come directly out of the system. And again, you'll see that audit trail here, but I had mentioned that there was a way to actually look at that information further. If I really wanted more detail, I have a functionality called change logs that is built in here. Okay. Change log entries. So I've actually activated even a more detailed audit trail specifically for my vendor records. And this is where I can then actually track the system date and time, who the user was. And if you scroll over here, you're going to notice that it's actually tracking what the value was and what the new value was. So now I can actually see a history of what was changed and what was it before it was changed. And that's available throughout the system. Additionally, on the vendor record, I can define banking information. So here's an example of where I've defined banking information for this vendor. This vendor prefers to be paid via ACH. They don't want us to print a check and mail it to them. So I've actually added to their banking information to the vendor record, and I've indicated that this vendor wants to be paid electronically. So I can do that vendor by vendor. I can make that choice. And then as the payment processing is occurring, there's a process where all of the invoices are selected that are to be paid, pending to be paid. And the system is going to recognize, oh, when I pull invoices for Amazon, I need to create an ACH file that uploads to the bank. And then when I pull invoices for my local hardware store, I want to print a check in-house that's going to be mailed to them. So it will recognize that as I'm doing the whole payment processing. So as part of that payment processing, I'll say, pull in all my invoices that I want to pay, print checks for the ones that want checks, print what we call remittance advices that then get emailed to the vendor and say, this is what we're paying you electronically, and then creating the file that uploads to the bank. And that's all built, again, within the system, no third-party functionality at all. One thing you'll notice here is that I've got a logo on this vendor picture here. So in this list view, if I wanted to see this in a little bit different view, I do have the option to actually show it with those logos as well. So again, that's just another one of those ways to be able to personalize the view with how you want to work in the system. I'm going to take a look at the purchasing functionality. So I'm going to go to my purchase orders listing. So here are some purchase orders that are currently in the system. And you see that some say encumbered, which means they're reflected in that encumbrance column in my chart of accounts. You'll see that some say new. So new tells me it's something that's been entered. Either it hasn't been submitted for approval or it hasn't been fully approved yet. So I'm going to drill on one that's been encumbered. I want to look at it a little more. So you'll see there's my vendor information. Here's my line item detail for my purchase order, and you'll see there's my account coding string. And some of these segments were optional, so they got left blank on this particular field. And then I have number of approvals. So this is an item that went through our workflow approval process. So it shows you who approved it, who submitted the transaction, and when it was approved. Also within this screen, I'm going to just slide over here a little bit. You'll see that there's an area here having to do with receiving and invoicing. So I've ordered 10 items. One of the things that we want to avoid is duplicate entry whenever possible. So the system's designed for you to come in and indicate that you received the goods and that you received the invoice. Once it's been received and invoiced, it automatically creates the invoice and accounts payable. There's no additional data entry that has to happen. And part of that process then is that it actually moves it from the encumbrance column to that actual column as part of that process. This can be split as far as duties. So if I have programs that are entering their own requisitions and they're receiving their own goods because they're being shipped directly, you might have those programs doing the receiving part of the process. The invoice then gets mailed to accounting, and accounting does the invoicing process. Both of those functions have to be completed before that invoice can be prepared to be paid. So we can split those duties if that's appropriate. So I talked about that integration with our Office products, and you saw how we already integrate very nicely with Excel. Additionally, I'm going to use this as an example. This particular report, when we first set up the system, the default purchase order is not real pretty. So what we did is we went out and created a Word template, a mail merge document. You'll see it looks much nicer than what you would expect as a kind of a default out of the box. So we've added our company logo here. This is my company logo up at the top. I've added a company information, vendor information, whatever I want to do on this. So if I have specific vendor instructions, for example, I want to make sure that the vendor knows that they always need to reference the purchase order number on any invoice that they send us. Or I have other terms, this purchase order is only valid for 90 days. I can put any of that additional verbiage here because, again, it's just a Word document. And then I've leveraged that merge functionality to pull this information directly from the database. Oops. Let me cancel out of that screen. We'll come over and look at one. You'll see here's the purchase order that has not been encumbered yet. So maybe I'm going in and reviewing the system and say, why has not encumbered? Where is it in our process? So as I scroll down, I'm going to see that now I have a status of approval pending. So someone has entered this purchase order and submitted it, and it's now going through our workflow engine. So it's now going through a process of needing an approval from someone else in the organization. I can drill in on this and see who it's pending for. So I can see that it's open and it's pending and it's waiting on Carla for it to be approved. So when we talk about approvals, this is all driven by what we call workflows. So my workflows, I'm going to close the screen and come take a look at another screen. So we have this function called workflow that we can define. And I have one here that's active called PO transaction. So at the simplest level, I've created a workflow that says for every purchase order and requisition, it needs to be approved, no matter what the amount is, by a single person. So right now I'm set up as the approver for all purchase orders and requisitions that are entered into the system. However, if I click in this criteria area, just want to show you what this list looks like, I can have any number of criteria used to drive these approvals. So I can indicate, depending on what the department is, maybe if it's being coded to the finance department, it needs to be approved by the finance director. I can also have amount thresholds. So maybe coded to the finance department, if it's over $75,000, it has to be approved by the finance director and by the VP of finance. So higher levels can have an extra level of approval. I can also have approvals that go multiple routes. So for example, I might have an entry that if it's coded to the general ledger account for computer equipment, regardless of the department, then IT wants to review it first. So we want to make sure the people within our organization are purchasing equipment that is based on our corporate policy. They may look at a request for a laptop and say, oh, we have 6 brand new laptops ready to be distributed. You don't need to buy a new one. So then I can have anything that's coded to computer equipment automatically route to IT first. If they approve it, then we can have it route based on those department codes, and then it can go to the finance director for approval. So I can have multiple levels of approval. I can have that amount threshold levels as well. These approvals can also be defined on journal entries. So you'll see that here in a little bit as well. So it's not just the purchasing mechanism. One of the questions that often comes up is maybe my approvers are people that are not in the financial system all the time. And the first question is, how am I going to know when things are ready for me to approve? So by default, the system will send an email alert out, and you actually define those email templates as part of the setup. So just to give you an example of, here's the template for journal entries, and it's just indicating that there's a journal entry that needs to be approved and what the amount is and how the coding has been defined. I have another example with regard to purchase orders. So it's just to give you an idea, but these templates are defined as part of the setup of the system. So I could go so far as to add other verbiage in here that tells the user, please remember that our corporate policy is that all items are approved within a 24-hour time frame. And then maybe even put a link here that takes them right to the website for the financial system. So they can just click on it right from their phone or from their iPad and go ahead and do those approvals. Close this and come back to my purchase order. So for organizations that process a lot of purchase orders, one of the things that often comes up is questions around being able to repeat purchase orders or being able to reissue the same purchase order. So maybe from our office supply store, I'm always ordering the same 10 items, maybe different quantities, maybe the price varies, but it's always the same 10 items. If I'm looking at any particular purchase order, so if I were to start a new purchase order, for example, I have the ability to copy a previous purchase order. So I can say, go out and look at the purchase order we did last month. I want you to copy all of those lines into this purchase order. And then all I need to do is edit the prices or edit the quantities that I need. So it can really help streamline that data entry. There's also functionality within the vendor record where maybe it's not always the same purchase order, but maybe I have a vendor that I send 3 kinds of purchase orders to, and there are different lists of criteria. So maybe one is for school supplies and the other is for office supplies. So I can, on the vendor's record, also create a default line item setup so that when I create the purchase order, I say, go out and look at my Amazon vendor and pull in the lines that I've defined for office supplies, or pull in the lines that I've defined for classroom supplies. Again, to help streamline that data entry. One thing I haven't shown quite yet is another functionality with regard to being able to store supplemental information. So you'll see that there's a box here that says file attachments. So in all of my transactional detail, as well as my master records, I have the ability to attach documents. So on my Amazon vendor, for example, I might have a copy of the W-9 or a copy of our contract agreement with them. On the purchase order, I might have a copy of my quotes that I was required to obtain before I could order this very expensive item. So I can attach any type of documents here. So you'll see that this is a Word document, but I could attach a PDF or an Excel spreadsheet, whatever makes sense as part of that documentation. A lot of times organizations have another way that they're currently managing their documents. Maybe that's done on SharePoint or OneDrive. So you'll see up here if I'm going to shift this window, I've also got the ability to put in links. So I can actually put in a link to a hard drive location or a SharePoint location instead of bringing the document right into the database. So I have both options. Variably, when we're looking at this purchase order list, most organizations are not going to have a short list like this. So I'm looking at this list, I've got thousands of entries in here. If I want a quick way to see what's not been encumbered, or a quick way to see what do we have pending for Amazon, over here on the left-hand side of the screen, I have this option to filter the list. So similar to that view that I defined on the chart of accounts, I have the same kind of functionality throughout the system. So I can do this looking on a vendor list or an employee list. I'm going to filter the list and say I want to filter it by the vendor number, and I only want to look at the things for Amazon. And when I do that, you'll see that it immediately narrows down my list. And so now, again, I've got kind of that on-demand reporting ability without running any reports. I've got that just at my fingertips. I'm going to clear this view. And then as far as purchase orders and requisitions are concerned, the system automatically carries those forward year to year. There is no process where items are automatically closed out or you have to tell the system to roll them forward. So once an item's encumbered, it just remains in encumbered status until you do the receiving, regardless of where your fiscal year falls. So there's never any kind of month-end process that you're required to do to bring those forward, or year-end process. Okay, I'm going to jump over to our journal entry screen. There's just a couple of things I want to highlight here. So we talk about that chart of accounts, and you saw those columns for budget and actual. Part of what this highlights is this is one way that budgets can be brought into the system. So I can do manual budget entries. I can also import journal entries, and there is a very simple import template that does that. And then we also have a budget planning tool. So if you had a budgeting process where you have users outside of finance that are part of that budgeting process and need to be interactive with it, then there's another tool for that as well. So I'm going to open up a journal entry screen. So I mentioned earlier that it's possible to define workflows with regard to journal entries. So this is an example of where maybe I have an accounting tech that can prepare journal entries, but they need to be approved by the accounting manager before they can be posted. And so in an old system, I might have my accounting tech is doing something in an Excel spreadsheet, they print it out, they give it to the accounting manager who signs off on it. It then has to be entered again to get it into the system. So now what I've done is I've incorporated that approval process in the system. So my tech has entered the journal entry, they've entered GL accounts, those account strings that we talk about, submitted it for approval, and now it's waiting on to be approved. You're going to see I have actually several lines here, because what happened for me as the end user is I entered in the journal entry, and then maybe the accounting tech realized, oh, I missed something. I forgot to add a department, or it's not the right department. I was able to unsubmit that entry, make the correction, and submit it again, and now it's pending for approval. So that's why you're seeing these extra lines here, because again, it maintains that full audit trail of actually what's happened in the system. Notice that I have that file attachment box here too. So if I had a desire to have my supporting documentation for my journal entry in the system, I can attach that here too. And you'll see that there is the ability to import from Excel. Where I often see this function being used is if there are regular journal entries done that are multiple line items, numerous line items, maybe there's a template set up in Excel where just the amounts are updated, and then that can be imported into this journal. Imports are required to go through all the same business rules. So as an accounting tech, I can import a journal entry, but as soon as I hit submit, it's then going to stop and wait for that same approval before it'll hit the general ledger. All right, so ultimately, one of the things that we have to do is reconcile our bank accounts. We're talking about that full integration in the system. So as I'm processing anything that affects cash, it's going to get captured by what we call the cash management functional area. And then that all gets incorporated into the bank rec. So as I'm processing accounts payable invoices and payroll transactions and deposits and customer receipts, that all gets pulled into the banking part of the system. And then when I get ready to do a bank reconciliation, what you see over here on the right-hand side is all of that activity that's been getting processed that's still flagged as uncleared. So it's going to be the current month's activity plus any open transactions for last month's bank reconciliation. I'm going to see my EFT transactions, checks that are processed, deposits that are entered are all going to come into this view. On the left-hand side, what this is showing is that I actually had the ability to access the bank account. So as a client, I can go in, access my bank account, pull down my statement activity for the past month, the month I'm trying to reconcile, and then that can be imported into the bank reconciliation. And then there's a process where you can tell the system that you want to automatically match transactions. If the date and the amount on the bank statement matches within a couple of days either way for the activity that processed through the system, I want you to automatically match it up. You can also manually match things. So if you have something that cleared with a slightly different amount, you can still choose to match it and tell the system to post an adjustment for the difference. If there are items on the bank statement that are not yet in the system, so bank fees or interest earned, I can also indicate in this screen, when I'm done with this bank reconciliation, I want you to go ahead and create that journal entry to post my interest or post my bank fees. So this workspace is a temporary workspace that's saved, but it does not prevent any other work in the system. So I started this bank rec several months ago, and I'm not quite done with it. Hopefully you're not taking that long to do your bank recs, but I can then simply close my bank reconciliation, go back to doing whatever I need to do, and then come back in here and pick up where I left off tomorrow and finish the bank reconciliation. So ultimately, we capture all this financial information, and in the end, we really need to be able to report out of the system. So there are a wealth of reporting options. Every one of the functional areas has its own set of standard reports. So while I can see a couple of these are on my main page, like my aged AP or my aged AR by fund reports, but maybe I need to look for something else. I want to see a report that shows the status of all my open purchase orders. And I don't see it here on my role center. Maybe I don't know what the report's called, so doing a search doesn't always make sense. I can actually go out to a view that shows me every single option that's in the system. So now I'm looking at a view that shows all the functional areas, all the possible options. As I scroll down, like here are all of my standard reports in the general ledger. Here's just an example of my standard reports and accounts. So that, again, that's another way I can get at the information and the functions within the system. In addition to the standard reports, we have what are called account schedules. So the account schedules are the report writing tool within the financial system. So you'll see up here I have options that say row layouts and column layouts. And this is really just a simple way to define a financial statement specific to your needs in reporting. So for example, I might have a report where I want roll-ups of maybe one line that says personnel, not a list of all of my wages and fringe accounts. Additionally, then I define the columns going across the top of the page. So similar like you would in a spreadsheet, I can define different what we call column layouts, which is going across the top of the page. So here's an example of one where I've kind of mirrored my chart of accounts. I want actual, encumbrance. If I wanted commitment in here, I would simply add a column to that. And then I can add some formulas in here. So it's just a report writer tool that's within the financial system. Additionally, we have a tool called Analytics. And so I had shown where that was on my framework. My initial launching pad into the system, I have this Analytics tool. So this is our graphical business intelligence tool. The nice thing about this, because it's developed by Serenic, it is not limited to the licensing of the financial system. So while I might have 10 financial users, if I have 100 employees that need to be able to look at budget to actuals and manage their own part of the budget, I can give them access to this tool and create spreadsheets or create dashboards that reflect what they need to be able to look at. So if I were doing, I can access general ledger data. I can access data from the grants management module. So if I'm receiving any kind of grant funding, I can quickly take a look at how we're doing with regard to those grants. I have payroll data available. And this comes directly from the payroll system. And then I can actually secure each one of these dashboards for the users that it's relevant to. So I might have a program manager that only has one dashboard here. I can tell you in this system, I've got about 20 dashboards defined, but I've only been granted rights to 20 of them, or 5 of them for purposes of this demo. So this just gives you an idea of what this looks like. I can click on these pie charts and be able to get into the detail that supports that chart, similar to what you saw from the chart of accounts. And then finally, one of the other reporting tools we have is a tool called Jet Reports. I just want to highlight this a little bit. This is an Excel add-in. The beauty of this is you've got all the power of Excel, so you can make it look as pretty as you want, but all of the financial information comes directly from the accounting system. I'm not hand keying any numbers in here. So I can do things like have Excel formulas as part of my format, but the amounts are coming directly from the financial system. So it's just another level of reporting that's available. And the other thing that we have built into the system is the month-end URES reporting that's required for North Carolina. So that's already a function of the system. It's not something that you have to worry about trying to build. And I know we're getting near to the top of the hour, but I want to touch a little bit on, we're not going to go into payroll and HR detail in very much detail because that will be a separate demonstration. But I do want to highlight our Employee Central. This is our employee self-service tool. And this is where employees will be able to go in and for themselves be able to pull up their own pay statements. So especially if I have employees that are direct deposit, I wouldn't necessarily want to have to mail out all those remittance devices or distribute them electronically. They can come in and get their own pay stub. You see that showing my earnings and deductions. This also highlights one of the really powerful features within the payroll system is the ability to manage leave. So I can have them calculating their leave earnings, tracking their leave taken, unpaid, and what their ending balance is. So employees can always come in and see what their leave balances are. They can also come in and get their own tax forms. So you'll notice here I've got my W-2. And as I bring it up here, you'll see that it's at the actual form. So even if you distribute them in paper initially, if someone loses their W-2, they can come in and get that for themselves. And then I can also create a library for my employees. So this is just an area where the administrator of the system has created headings for different kinds of documents. And then each one of these links is either a URL, So for example, my W-4 form goes right to the IRS website. And I might have files that are uploaded as well. So I can also upload like a Word document or PDF for information to be available to my employees. And to talk about this role center and how the look and feel changes based on who I am in the system, I'm going to change my view. So I'm changing my hats to payroll person. So what you're going to immediately notice is that this view is very different. So I don't have chart of accounts and funds and vendors anymore. I'm now a payroll manager. I have employees. I have the ability to process the payroll, do a time entry and calculations of the payroll, process the checks, review it, whatever my internal processes are. So my view is very different. One of the most important things I want to highlight here is that this is a fully integrated payroll and HR system. So what that means for us is for all of the information that is common between the two, name, address, social security number, that kind of information is accessible by both systems. There's no import or export of data. There's no transfer of data. Additionally, if you look over here on the right-hand side, you'll see just a subset, just some of the most common functions used within here. This box up there that says employee details is a lot of the HR functionality. Each one of those links, you have the ability to secure independently. So you can have your HR team have access to these functions with regard to HR management, certifications, job assignments, contracts. Payroll team has access to everything that is required to process a check. So things like, what is their hourly pay rate? What is their W-4 election? And so again, these are all secured independently so that you don't have overlap. So people are doing what they need to do in this system and leveraging that same security. Just one other thing I want to note is I did show here that we've got this, what we call time journal. And oftentimes we'll see organizations that already have a timekeeping system, a very robust system that works really well. And so this time journal then just becomes a receiving mechanism for importing. So we can import to this. You can also hand enter the information. So depending on how you're currently capturing your time, there are options to either import from some other system. There is a timesheet functionality built within the tool that employees could go in and enter their own time, or time can just be entered into this tool. Once this time's been processed, it then becomes part of the calculation process and moves forward to processing paychecks. So just as an example, some of the systems that we've created integrations with were Kronos, Synovia, there's just a variety of them. Tax, I think, is one.